And the reason I think this is because it allows us to ask all sorts of questions about the real problem, about what it is, what happens in brains that underlies what you happen to be conscious of right now, without getting sucked into the metaphysical plug hole of why you're conscious in the first place. In other words, it provides a powerful approach to looking for neural correlates of consciousness, those things in the brain that go along with being conscious, because we can now take advantage of a very general theory of how brains do what they do, rather than just looking at this region or that region. So what does predictive processing, or the Bayesian brain, say about consciousness specifically? Well, many years ago, some influential experiments revealed a very strong connection between top-down signaling and conscious contents. In this example by Alvaro Pascal-Leone and Vincent Walsh, what they did was they had people look at visual motion, examples of visual motion. And they used TMS, this interventional technique where you can zap the brain very briefly. I mentioned it before. But they used it here specifically to interrupt the top-down signaling that was evoked by this perception of visual motion. And the result was that if you interrupted specifically the top-down feedback, you would abolish the conscious perception of visual motion, even if you left the bottom-up signaling intact. So that was an early cue. Now, more recently, in our lab and in many other labs all over the place, we've been asking some other questions about the relationship between what you expect and what you consciously experience. One of the most basic questions you can ask is, do we consciously see what we expect to see, or do we see what violates our expectations of what we expect? And a recent study from our group, led by Yaya Pinto, used a method called continuous flash suppression to address this question. It's illustrated here. You see different images in the different eyes. In one eye, you see this rapidly changing Mondrian pattern of squares. And in the other eye, you'll either see a face or a house. And they change contrast like this. So initially, the person will just see this random pattern, and then they'll see either a house or a face. And simply, you just ask them to expect to see, you just tell them a face is more likely or a house is more likely. And what we find over a number of studies is that we see faces more quickly when that's what we're expecting to see. It may seem obvious, but it could be the other way around. At least in these studies, we see what we expect to see, not what violates our expectations. That's the data. And the same goes for houses. These kinds of studies support the idea that it's the top-down predictions that are really important for determining what we're conscious of. There's another experiment which I will just mention. We did pretty much the same thing. This is called motion-induced blindness. If you're in a lab rather than in a lecture theatre and you stare at this central point here, then this red dot might disappear from time to time. And what we did was, after it disappeared, we changed its color, and we led people to expect the color change to be one thing or another. And again, it reappeared more quickly if it changed color in the way you were expecting. Again, confirming that once your expectations were validated, then that accelerated your conscious awareness of something in the world. Okay. Now that's just behavioral evidence. It's just asking people what they see and when they see it. We've also been interested in the brain mechanisms that underlie and shape how our expectations change what we consciously see. And we've been particularly interested in something called the alpha rhythm. Now, the alpha rhythm is an oscillation at about 10 hertz or 10 cycles per second. That's especially prominent in the visual cortex across the back of the brain. In one study led by, in this case, our PhD student Maxine Sherman with Rota Kanai in Sussex, what we did here, we manipulated people's expectations of what they were likely to see. And it's a very boring experiment, this one. The only thing they could see was, we call these Gabor patches. They're just very dim patches of lines that are blurry around the edges. But the visual system loves these kinds of things. They activate early visual cortex very, very well. And people were expecting either that a patch was there or that it wasn't there in different conditions. And while doing this, we measured brain activity. And to cut a long story short, what we found was that there were certain phases, certain parts of this cycle, this 10 hertz cycle, at which your expectation had a greater effect on what you said that you saw. So there was part of this cycle, as the alpha rhythm did this, there was part of it where your expectations dominated your perception. And there's another part of it which was the opposite, where your sensory signals were more important in determining what you saw at that point. So this suggests that this oscillation in the back of the brain is orchestrating this exchange of predictions and prediction errors, and that's the sort of cycle that might be the neural mechanism for conscious vision. And other theories about what the algorithm is doing, there are many ones. One is like that it's doing nothing, it's just the brain idling away. I think this is at least a more interesting way to think about it. Another experiment we've done with another PhD student, Asa Chang, we show people these very fast-changing luminance sequences, and it turns out that your brains will learn to predict the specific changes in these sequences. They're changing very, very quickly. And the signature of this learning, again, happens to be in the algorithm, again suggesting that this oscillation has something important to do with how the brain learns and updates predictions about sensory signals. But we do not go around the world looking at Gabor patches or rapidly changing things like this. We go around the world looking at people and objects, and that's what our visual world is composed of. So can any of these ideas say anything about our everyday visual experience? And I think that's a very important challenge in neuroscience, to get out of the lab and think about real-world experiences. So we've been using virtual reality over the last few years to try to get at some of these ideas. This is an Oculus Rift, which is now available to buy, I think, or consume. And we've been using these to address some of these real-world aspects of visual perception. And one of these real-world aspects is called perceptual presence. And this is the observation that in normal perception, objects really seem to be there, as opposed to being images of objects. And this is, of course, what Magritte plays with in his famous painting, The Treachery of Images. For instance, this is an object, I think it's there, and in some sense I can perceive the back of it, even though I can't see the back of it, even though the back of it's not giving me any sensory data, I perceive it as an object with a back. How does one explain that? Well, one idea you can come up with within this Bayesian brain framework is that the brain is not only predicting the possible causes of the sensory signals it's getting right here, right now, but it's also predicting how sensory signals would change were I to make particular actions, were I to pick this object up and move it around, or just move my eyes from one place to another. There's a long paper I wrote about that, which I don't read. Please don't read it. But that's the basic idea. And how do you test an idea like that? So we've been using some innovative virtual reality methods, or augmented reality methods, with my postdoc, Kesuke Suzuki. And what we do is we have virtual objects. And these virtual objects, well, they either behave as a normal object would. They're all weird, unfamiliar objects. But they can either behave as a normal object would behave. So you can learn to predict what would happen. This one is weird. It always shows you the same face, a little bit like having the moon on a plate in front of you. And then there are other conditions where objects respond to your movements, but they do so in unreliable and strange ways. So the question is, what does the brain learn about these objects, and how do we experience them? Do we experience them as objects in different ways when they behave differently? And we're still doing those experiments. Another way we can use VR is to investigate what happens in visual hallucinations of the kind experienced in psychosis and in certain other more pharmacologically induced conditions. So this, what we're doing here is we're coupling immersive virtual reality, imagine you've got a headset strapped to your head again, with clever image processing that models the effects of overactive priors on visual perception to generate a highly immersive experience. This is Sussex campus, actually, but now it seems quite different than it did at lunchtime today, I'll tell you that. What we've done, we've recorded this panoramic video, which we can feed back through a VR headset, and we've processed this video through one of these Google Deep Dream algorithms you might have seen that can generate sort of bowls of pasta that look like animals. And this might seem like a lot of fun. It is fun, but there is a serious purpose here, because it allows us to model the effects, model very unusual forms of perception and how they might play out in different ways in the visual hierarchy. And understanding how visual hallucinations might happen and how the wider effects they have on the mind, I think, is a very important part of studying visual perception. So that brings us to the second take-home message, which is that what we consciously see is the brain's best guess of the causes of its sensory input. Normal perception is a fantasy that is constrained by reality.
Hello, I'm Allison. I have read a lot about neuroscience since 2003 and is fond of it. In 2016, I discovered a great novel on neuroscience, the unique book I'd like to share with you on this channel here for 3 reasons. 1. It shows you an original approach to neuroscience that has been never done before. 2. It's quite well written, you're totally captivating. That's an amazing thriller. And 3. It is based on a serious and true study about electromagnetic harassment. I highly recommend you this book entitled Neuroscience, Crime and Corruption, White Mind Distortion for 2 main reasons. 1. It deals with neuroscience in a totally different way as usual. The innovative form used is a novel. And I'm pretty sure that you have never ever read a novel about neuroscience, but articles and studies. The second reason is the quality of the book. Well, it's pretty good written and the story is captivating. You can click on the link here to know more about the story, which is a thriller. What I can tell you is I couldn't help myself reading when I started. I was so in. The characters are incredibly amazing, and the story is so unbelievable. What an experience. So if you want to know more about this book, and I think I'm gonna make more videos like this, just click here. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and share this video. Bye.